So good day, everyone. Welcome to this special edition of Community Central. My name is Brian Proffitt, Community Analyst with the Open Source and Standards team. I'm pleased to welcome you to this episode of Community Central, where we're going to have with us today Matt Bernius. Matt is going to be speaking about what college students do and don't know about free software. Before he begins, let me tell you a little bit about him. Matt is a design anthropologist and experienced strategist who's worked with companies like Autodesk and Boeing and Google, Honeywell, Kodak, Mozilla, Pricewaterhouse, and to understand the needs of their customers and also their employees. And right now, he is currently the lead user researcher and strategist at Measures for Justice. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Matt. He'll give his presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A period at the end. Feel free to use the Q&A tool in your prime time window to ask questions so we can get to those after Matt's presentation. Thank you again, Matt, for joining us today, and go ahead and lead on.
Excellent. Well, as Brian said, I'm going to be talking about what college students do and don't know about free and open source software. And before I begin, I just wanted to send out a big hat tip to Jenna from Red Hat, who you'll see in this presentation. And this is based on something that she and I presented at LibrePlanet. So what we're going to go through in today's little class or little session is really what are the problems that we found in our research, in my research around what students know and don't know about open source, the challenges to teaching open source, and then spend a little bit of time talking about what you can do to help both as individuals, and Red Hat is already doing a lot as an organization, and hopefully this will share a little bit of some of those efforts of Jenna and Tom Calloway and others. So really quickly about me, as you heard, I'm a design anthropologist, so I have a background both in anthropology and in UX design, and the work that I'm going to be sharing with, which is based on research I have been conducting with college students across the US, was primarily sponsored by the Mozilla Open Source Student Network, and I'll explain a little bit more about them in a moment. So to center this, why this research happened is, I think as everyone's aware, there are a lot of students studying program out there. And in fact, in 2014 to 2015, roughly 60,000 students graduated with degrees in computer and information sciences in the US alone. And if we project that number over the 4 years of a school, most colleges 4 to 5 years, we're talking, over close to 200,000 students potentially studying programming at one time just in the US. And that's a lot of people who could be involved in open source projects, but the reality is that we're not seeing a high degree of participation from them. And so Mozilla got very interested in why exactly is this the case. They've had years to reach out to students. I'm planning to start another program called the Open Source Student Network, and engaged with me to conduct ongoing research on this topic. And so what I'm sharing with you today is the result of surveying with over 140 students across 20 universities, then in-person and remote interviews with about 40 students, 10 faculty members, and additionally advocates for open source literacy and teaching open source, as well as literally getting onto campus and attending a number of club meetings and student events. And again, big thank yous to Mozilla for funding all this research. And on the right side of the screen, you can see some of the photos of people who participated in the survey and places that we went to. Now, the exciting news is that across all the research, I found significant interest in free and open source software development across the board. What you're seeing here is actually a picture of the first meeting of the New York University Open Source Student Club. And there were literally more than 60 students in that room. There's an entire row of students who are sitting on the floor that are not captured in this photo. Line was out the door. So there is a really big interest in doing open source software. And there are a number of key reasons, and I want to dive into a few of these, but really quickly, students really are interested in making things. They see this as a way of developing and improving their skills. They love the idea of being part of a community, building a portfolio that will hopefully get them work, and ultimately changing the world. And this was, I thought, one of the coolest quotes that I had around that desire to make things. Is this young woman, Han, had started her career at Michigan State as a mechanical engineering major, and she ended up switching over to computer science because she realized she could make more things in computer science than she could as a mechanical engineer. And across all of my interviews, this idea of making things was so critical to these students. And they believed or they felt that open source was a great way to get at that. Another thing that we heard a lot of was giving back. And so this is Nikhil, who's a graduate student at UC Irvine. And he's actually a math major, but he does a lot of programming in Python as part of that. And he really saw open source as a way and as sort of a political choice to create better tools for the world. And since he's a scholar and someone engaged in science, he really felt that open source was the right way to grow the body of scientific knowledge as a whole. And then this last one that we heard over and over again is this idea of scratching your own itch. And so Tristan uh, was a student who got involved in open source and actually was contributing to active open source projects because he wanted to make the software better for himself to use, to submit bug reports, and then beginning to build the software. As he said at the end, he started to build the confidence to actually try and help fix his solutions. And across all of the colleges and that I talked to, especially ones that had student clubs, they were constantly interested in building tools to make their college experience better. And they saw open source and open source technologies as a way to do this. So when we heard all this information, when we saw the initial numbers on the survey that we ran to begin this research and saw lots of students saying they participated in open source projects, we thought this is great. This is awesome. You know, our job is going to be so easy. But there was only one issue, and it gets summed up really, really well in a story that I tell about my first time meeting Jenna, which is Jenna had come to RIT for their Women in Computing hackathon, and she was leading the open source track there in the open source judging. And of the 13 teams, or excuse me, of the 15 teams that entered the open source track, 13 were disqualified for not having licenses in their GitHub account. And I had to watch Jenna over and over patiently explain that it's not enough to put your code on GitHub. You need to have a license within it. And each group said almost the exact same thing. You just taught us an entire class on open source. I had been told, and by the way, when we say told there, it's not necessarily told by another student. Sometimes that's by a faculty member, that being on GitHub was enough. I had never heard about licensing before. And what we started to find is through the research, through the interviews, as I began to scratch the surface and really talk to these students about what open source was, how they're interacting with it, what we found was that their understanding of open source isn't accurate and often did not match, it was deficient in key areas, whether it was licensing or whether it was the community work. And so really I kind of fibbed. It wasn't that there was just only one issue. There were really lots of issues that these students were dealing with. And I'm going to take you through some of those. Time is always a gigantic challenge for these students. And the students who were the most likely to be interested in open source and involved with it also were the ones who had a crazy amount of commitments. And so even students who had had some actual successful participation with open source projects were often feeling at a point where they didn't feel like they could make a meaningful enough contribution. And their concept of contribution is a major code contribution to actually be worth it to participate in a community. So the idea of simply writing a bug report or doing something like that, students didn't understand the value that that could be contributed. Some of the smaller, easier things to do. A second huge thing that we heard over and over again was the code base, and I'll get into some aspects of this. But this comment from Eric at Georgia Tech perfectly summed up what we heard over and over again. They looked at the code base, they had no idea to begin, and they just felt like it would, as Jenna point out, one of the challenges is that a lot of open source projects don't have solid onboarding materials that really help a student or other participants come on. There's some also ways about the way computer science is being taught that exacerbate this as well. Intimidation is a huge factor across all campuses, and we were talking with really high-powered students at places like RPI, RIT, Georgia Tech, and we kept hearing over and over again this idea of, I wanted to contribute to a project, but I really got concerned that people would flame me because I don't feel like I'm a good programmer. And as Kathleen put it so perfectly, I was already struggling with imposter syndrome in my program, and I did not need any more added to me through a project. And the key thing that I need to mention here, and we'll get back to this at the end, is the reality is almost every student had either experienced or knew someone who had experienced flaming when they had tried to go on to a major project, or just had a really negative experience. And as those stories spread, that caused students to want to retreat away from that. And that has, I'll touch on it in a sec, has a really important implications about the types of projects that, quote unquote, open source projects that students were engaging in. And this was a huge issue as well, is that because this information isn't being well shared, a lot of students talked about how they didn't see a payoff in contributing to open source projects, which I will say, I have no idea how this will be received at Red Hat, but for Mozilla, this was such a surprise to hear students not being sure to how to answer a question like, how can you pay off your student loans by writing free software? Some of the students had an explanation for that, but they couldn't even necessarily convey it well to other students. Their own pressure. And so I love the idea of, like, they have parents who are asking them, how are you going to pay off your debts if you're doing free software? As a result, a lot of them said, well, I might do this after I leave school, or even I'm doing it in school, but it's largely a hobby, and it's just something I'll do if I can make time for it. And again, we get back to the not a lot of time issue. What this led to was we discovered that when students talked about working on an open source project, more often than not, they meant working on software they created by themselves. They had this little thing that they wanted to do. They put it up on GitHub. Maybe they put licensing on it. Maybe they didn't, but they saw that as doing open source. They didn't see, in most cases, doing open source as actively participating in a vibrant community, going through an entire pull request and a full version control process in that respect. And the reason for this is the reality was that on most college campuses, open source is learned in students' off time. And if they're lucky, during club times. It's almost always students teaching students, not professors teaching them. Really, when we look at it, there are only a handful of schools that have any sort of formalized open source curriculum, either as a single class or in some cases, like RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, as a minor. Those are the exceptions, not the rules. And the reality is, much like playing telephone, the moment that you get into this informal education environment, it's very easy for uh, incomplete, if not flat out wrong information to start to spread through a community and then create problems like what we saw at the Women in Computing Hackathon. So the reality, as I said, most programming students are not learning the necessary skills to contribute to existing open source projects. And here are some of the reasons why. One is that schools simply aren't teaching things like how to read code versus write it. The majority of students' time in an undergraduate CS program, almost from the beginning, is spent writing code because they don't get taught within a program combined with bad or less than optimal onboarding skills, students don't understand how to parse and how to join a project. And what's amazing is in the background here is a mapping of like all the relationships in Finnegan's Wake, which is a notoriously difficult work by James Joyce. There's no way that a freshman read Finnegan's Wake. If we think about it, it's like asking students to write additional content for a Joyce novel or add another act onto a Shakespearean tragedy, and then have all of the Shakespeare fans out there evaluate the work. That steps to how difficult and how intimidating a task this is. Another key thing about ComSci programs, and this is Wes Tasker, who heads ARCOS, the Rensselaer Center for Open Source, which is a faculty-student group that Red Hat has been involved with. But Wes pointed out that students regularly join ARCOS because they want the chance to collaboratively code and help solve problems. And the challenge with CS education is that collaborative coding is often seen as cheating, especially at those first 2 to 3 years that a student is in that program. So almost the idea that you can actually write code together or build sections together is not a skill that's reinforced within CS education as well. Why? What are all the reasons for these limitations? Well, there are major challenges on the faculty side. The reality is that the ACM doesn't place an emphasis on teaching open source. If you ask Jenna, she has a great sequence where she shows how there's only 2 small sections of open source within the teaching guidelines. They're both optional, and they are more or less appearing in for better, more or less footnotes. Most faculty members have little to no experience contributing to open source projects, especially, again, truly contributing to a project versus maybe spinning off their own code as an open source project. So they don't have that ability to pass that on to the students. It can take 2+ years to stand up a new course within a college environment. So even if you have someone who's a qualified instructor who wants to teach that, unless they've got like a special topics course, which you can kind of shift the content of each semester, if you want to have an official open source course, from the moment that you propose the course to when it finally is booked and run, again, easily 2 years. Finding funding for and publishing the results of open source research can be very difficult. And a lot of journals are not really focused on pedagogy or even the community aspects of open source. They're really looking at more novel programming problems. Now, again, those could be solved through open source, but there isn't a strong incentive necessarily right now to do a lot of open source work for publishing, and we'll get back to why that's so. And as we've heard over and over, sort of be in a position of not knowing everything. And I think anyone who's worked within open source and has attempted to contribute to a community, and especially is trying to solve needs that are emerging within an open source community, knows that you can't go in and know everything there. And so there's a large shift that needs to occur for a professor not to be the expert and to in some ways be in more of a collaborative relationship both with a project and with their students. And all of these things boil into one of the key things, which is the tenure process. And the tenure process, just the reality of it, it leaves little time to try new things in the classroom because so much of the focus has to be on fulfilling not only publishing expectations, but other things like service expectations and a variety of other tasks for a young professor. And it additionally creates a completely risk-averse climate where until an instructor knows that they have tenure, they don't want to do anything that's going to significantly rock the boat or, more importantly, disrupt their publishing or all the other pieces that they need to manage to get tenure. And tenure can take easily 5 to 7 years. So at the time where often a young professor is at their most creative, they're also being constrained in really key ways by the system. The other challenge with this is that open source projects and academia kind of run on different cycles as well. And so even if a professor or students want to contribute to a project, they have to figure out a way to get those execution times to fit in with, in some cases, quarters, or in other cases, semester long, essentially sprints. And so that takes a lot of coordination. Those pieces in with intimidation factor, students and professors alike get very, very concerned about successfully collaborating with open source projects, either within the classroom or outside of the classroom. So I know this sounds bleak, but I want to take you through some of the things that are being done to try and help this situation, and then I'll be wrapping up at about 10:30, and we'll dive right into questions. But there are a couple key things that are going on right now. There are some great programs that have launched in an attempt to solve these things. There are opportunities to mentor as part of this, and then also ways to make your communities more welcoming that I'd really like to touch on. In terms of program working to assist college students and professors with this, there are two approaches that are running at the same time. And the first one is some are taking a top-down approach. And two great examples of this are Teaching Open Source, teachingopensource.org, which is a collection of materials for teachers. This is all growing out of a second effort called Posse, the Professor's Open Source Software Experience, which is something that Red Hat has been, and actually I should say Jenna and Tom have been very involved in these efforts. And the goal here is to help get more teachers prepared to teach open source within the classroom and mentor students at the open source level. Posse runs a series of workshops throughout the year, hands-on weekends where they bring a small group of professors in and basically put them through an open source boot camp. And some of the pieces that you'll see here are things like bug gardening and other exercises that you can find. And the cool thing here is that teaching open source and these resources have been getting more and more traction and begin to appear in research presentations. And this is one where this particular exercise was being used as part of Dickinson College's approach to integrating some open source, humanitarian, free, and open source projects into their curriculum. Now, on the other hand, we have the Open Source Student Network, which is what Mozilla has been pulling together. And this is a project to foster difference and allow them to provide them with resources, both everything from money to pizza to activities and projects to work on. And when I say that, I want to make clear that clubs that are involved in the Open Source Student Network aren't simply working on Mozilla projects. Mozilla has been reaching out to other major open source projects, like they're about to, knock on wood, have something coming up, hopefully with Wikimedia, but also there's been some talk about Red Hat and other ones to present, to curate a list of projects and bugs that are really appropriate for students who are beginning to contribute to open source. And so the goal here is, as Posse and Teaching Open Source are trying to get more teachers online, Mozilla is trying to work on the club level to build more collaboration and resources for students to help each other in teaching, in learning and engaging, as well as engaging with clubs across the network. In terms of the community piece, be done involved in any sort of open source project is really work to make your communities more welcoming. And this is a perfect example of something we heard over and over again is when somebody wants to contribute, hearing someone in the community say, "Hey, look at the wiki," that question's answered somewhere else. And the reality is the problem of the noob is that when they look at the wiki, they don't understand the wiki. And so understanding that you need to improve onboarding materials, have better documented code, and those types of pieces. And there's a key reason for this beyond just simply encouraging students to participate in open source projects. It's when we were looking through the data, and this is something Jenna pointed out to me, and it was a really, as soon as she said it was really apparent, is students internalize every challenge that they face. So they get pushback like, look at the wiki noob, or that contribution sucks, or oh my gosh, I can't read all this code, it's too dense. They see that as a problem with their skills. And that only increases the level of imposter syndrome that they face. So any opportunity that we have to really help them understand those pieces and see that sometimes the issue isn't with them, it's something isn't well documented, that there isn't that information there, is a chance for them to feel more welcomed and actually to feel like they have the potential to be a really great contributor. To that point, mentoring is critical, and one of the things that people need to understand is that you don't need to be an expert to be a mentor. Uh, as Han put it, they just really need to understand what I'm going through, to have that sort of empathy and just really understand that there's that it's possible to get through this. And the other key thing is when looking for mentors is to try to make your mentor base as diverse as possible and then match based on that. It's not enough to have women contributors, people contributing from underrepresented communities. Anything you can do to encourage them to be a mentor. And again, this gets back to really helping people understand, because I don't think imposter syndrome ever goes away. And as much as students will struggle with it, often people will struggle with it, and that can be prevent people from mentoring and helping other people. Those are the types of things that students recognize. And what we do know in organizations that have put formal mentorship models into place always have the most successful students. And since it's 10:30 and I want to make sure we have ample time for questions, I'm going to wrap things up there, and then I'm happy to dive into anything that was covered here, or if you have any questions that might not have been covered in this, but you hope I might have talked to students about, I'd be happy to answer those as well.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Very much appreciate your presentation, and there's been a lot of interest generated on the chat. We have a few questions in the Q&A forum. If anybody has any additional questions, by all means, put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them in the time allowed. So the first question I have here is from Jan Jansky. Can we somehow contribute to create a better environment and attract more people into open source directly? And I'm not sure the context in which Jan is referring, but like what are some of the other things? You mentioned mentoring and you mentioned better onboarding, which are, these are things we try to drill in open source and standards as well. But are there other things that people at Red Hat can do to sort of, help attract people directly?
Yes, I think one thing that's always great is schools, whether it's for those of you in the Research Triangle area or beyond that, are always desperate for speakers. So simply getting out and talking about this to classes is really important. And again, it may sound incredibly crass, but I think sharing stories about how you have built a successful career in open source are critical for students to hear. And even if it's as blunt as, this is how I was able to pay off my student loans doing this, that's huge. And I don't think I personally realized that until it kept coming up. Again, there are those pieces. For those of you who are interested, Jenna has the contact information. We can get it as well for the Mozilla Open Source Student Network. If you've got small challenges that you think that would be good to get clubs interested in getting involved with, that's another way to do it. Supporting events like Hacktoberfest are okay. The challenge with something like Hacktoberfest or there's the December one, I want to say the 24 pull requests piece is Hacktoberfest comes at kind of a really bad time in the school year. It's often in the middle of a fall break. Students are going in for midterms, and so that's a moment when they want to contribute. What they have to do within classes can prevent them from going into that. But all of those, any of those small contributions can help a lot and really bring more students on board.
Okay, great. So another question from Rob Cernich. Have you considered how the open source body of topics can fit in with university accreditation? His point is that curricula is largely governed by accrediting bodies, for example, ABET. And how does that sort of all fit together?
That's a really great question. I think that's where there's some disappointment about how little the ACM emphasizes this. And even when we look at some of the big education conferences like SIGC, and I can never remember what SIGC stands for, there may be birds of a feather session on open source, but open source is not necessarily seen as valuable in the core curriculum. And part of this goes back to, I think, a shift that's been happening or is slowly happening within ComSci programs towards trying to figure out a way to do more collaborative work. And I think that that's where the opportunity for open source is to enter. I think for quite a while there's been an emphasis on almost training ninja perception, and to some degree the way that a lot of companies were recruiting coders made it seem like those types of skills were more desirable versus the skills that you learn involved in open source. The more that that groups like Red Hat, like the To Do Group, which is a number of large companies coming together to talk about open source, can really pressure schools to value the skills that you learn in open source and reinforce that there is career paths in open source. That's probably going to be one of a much faster way than going through accreditation type pieces. But I think there should be pressure put on that as well.
Okay, great. So a more personal question for you. Myself is interested in what university did you study anthropology, and how did they enable you to, study open source cultures? And are there other universities, or perhaps I could add to that, even programs that also teach studying open source and communities around open source projects?
Oh, great question. So the very, very quick history, I went to the Rochester Institute of Technology for my undergraduate, and that was in new media publishing. And I got very lucky to be graduating right at the time where the World Wide Web was hitting it big, and ended up working at Kodak for a while. And that got me very interesting questions about how digital cameras were changing the way that people took photographs and thought about photographs. And that led me to the University of Chicago, where I was incredibly lucky to be there doing my master's at the same time. Biella Coleman was finishing her PhD. And for those of you who might not have heard of Biella, she's first studied the Debian project and then wrote a very well-known book on Anonymous. And so she has been at the forefront, one of a number of people, of studying open source cultures. I also was working on my PhD at Cornell. I did not complete it. But that's a school. A lot of the tech schools, like MIT, also have anthropology and groups that are interested in that. Now, as far as learning open source, and this may be what Jenna's going to be popping in for, Rensselaer Polytechnic has courses on it, but the really good one, I'm very proud to say, is my alma mater. Steve Jacobs at RIT put together the country's first open source minor, which has courses that are focused on the legal issues, the community issues, and some other pieces around that.
And welcome to Jenna for who joined us on this call. Continuing on with questions, because we really want to get to those. From Tommy Kantz, has anybody looked at open source student participation in disciplines outside of programming, like things like design and documentation, which are also areas that the open source communities are interested in?
Jenna, are you going or am I going?
I got it. So we know that there are some classes that kind of touch on open source stuff that's not NCS. It's limited, very limited. I just had a lecture on open source licensing for some students at Western Oregon University, and one of the students was a double major in design and computer science, and she said that all they talked about in their design program was plagiarism, and they hadn't talked about Creative Commons at all. So that's really common also. So I'd say if we're here with open source in computer science, it's even smaller outside of computer science. Smaller.
I would, teeny. Yeah, smaller, teeny. And teeny. Even in student projects, for as much of the challenges there is onboarding coders, there's an even larger challenge onboarding designers. So people who are interested in UX or those pieces. So if we talk about skills that are not being taught, or at best are developed very, very late in the student's career when they move more towards open-ended project courses, the idea of how to talk to a designer and utilize design within that is one of the last things that a computer scientist or somebody who's learning programming is taught. And so as a result, what I've seen lots of times is students from outside who are not programmers but have skills that could contribute show up to open source hackathons and no one knows what to do with them, unfortunately. And they're like, go do that corner of the room and draw some pretty pictures, and when we need you, we'll call you. And so that is another huge area. It's actually one that I'm hoping to do some work on next as a side project.
Excellent. Okay, great. An additional question from, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, from Roshni Patath. Wouldn't outreachy be a good answer for getting the concern of earning value out of an open source contribution? And outreachy is certainly one of the programs that Red Hat is very much involved in. The diversity and inclusion mentoring program that was originally started by the GNOME Foundation. Also, Google Summer of Code is certainly in that, and that bailiwick too. But I mean, how do you feel, Matt, about formal mentoring programs like that?
Oh, 100%. We need more of them. Like, outreachy is just awesome. I was lucky to meet some of the folks from that at this year's Libre Planet, and they did gosh, I'm forgetting who it was. She's one of the organizers. Marina, thank you. Marina did an amazing presentation of just the progress that outreachy has made, and it was so inspiring to see, and it's exactly the type of model that we need to see replicated by other groups.
Okay.
And it's worth mentioning that outreachy is absolutely fantastic. it still reaches a relatively tiny number of the computer science students. And whether a student finds out about outreachy in the first place, they kind of have to be, working with one of the teachers we work through Posse, or in some way already semi-connected to the open source community. If you're at random school doing a computer science degree, no one has probably mentioned outreachy to you. And that's one of the things we're trying to fix with this work with instructors, is getting the message out to a much broader audience.
And can I build off of that, actually? Because I think that that is critical to understand. And that's, thank you for bringing that up. One of the things is that depending on what school you go to is exactly going to shape your open source experience beyond outreachy. What we find, and what's amazing about Posse, is if we can get even one excited instructor to talk about open source outside of the classroom, you suddenly see a real growth there, especially when you've got students who are interested as well. The challenge is that the reality is that with colleges, you have essentially a whole new group of kids every 6 years. And the culture in a program can completely change in 6 years because of that. You get some classes that are really filled with kids who are outgoing and want to do that. You sometimes get classes that are filled with introverts. And so the part of the reason why it's important to be dealing with this problem at two levels, both at the faculty level and at the student level, is that the students are where the energy comes from, but faculty provide the continuity. And the more that we can get faculty members to know about things like outreachy and these pieces, the better chance we have of sustained open source education going on a college campus.
Okay, we have run out of time, which is unfortunate. We had some really great questions queued up, but we are at the end of our time for today. So I'd like to thank Jenna and also Matt for coming in and speaking with us today about the challenges that communities and projects face when working with college students in a formal curriculum. Matt, thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Community Central. We very much appreciate it.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Okay, great. And this broadcast has been recorded, and we will post it online later today, and there will be an announcement about that. We thank you all again. We look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of Community Central. Thank you very much, and have a great day.